Welcome to All the F Words,
a podcast where two writer friends nearly 30 years apart explore everything we give an F about. I'm Gabi Moskowitz.
And I'm Joanne Green. On each episode of All the F Words, we'll focus on a theme starting with the letter F. Things like firstborns, first times, fantasy, and finality.
We'll share stories from our lives and our distinct generational perspectives and look to the experts for insights and ideas.
Today we're going to talk about fairness, where the concept comes from, how it's defined, and who it is that thinks that life and everything in it is supposed to be, or even could possibly be, fair.
Why do I think white privilege is going to come up in this conversation?
Well, apropos to that, Gabi, one of the very definitions of fairness is having light-colored hair or a pale complexion.
How strange that the term for impartiality and justice would also cover light skin.
Or maybe not so strange? And I'm sure we'll get into that later. The first definition of fairness is the state, condition, or quality of being fair or free from bias or injustice, even-handedness. So my question to jumpstart our conversation today is, do you think that's achievable? Can we ever be free from bias?
I don't think so. I think bias is part of the way our brains work. Our brains are always trying to simplify the information in front of us. We're stereotyping. We're trying to make things easy and clean. And as we know, life is complex, but our brains want it to be easier for us to perceive the information that we're receiving. So I think that humans are by nature biased. That said, I do think that with a lot of work, it is possible to further cultivate a culture of trying to override our biases and our tendencies to not see things as complexly as they are, if that makes sense. What do you think?
It makes total sense. Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. And I would add to the fact that our brains are wired to not only simplify, but to put things into boxes and categories. It's just the way we work. But also, I think we are little sponges and we are absorbing messages from the moment we're born, from our environment, from the people around us. And, now in the internet age, certainly from the messages that are bombarding us in every direction from every device. So where we live matters. Our families certainly matter. Our communities matter. And the images that we see, all of it plays a part in creating bias and therefore taking us further and further away from this idea of fairness. I mean, there are obviously lots of little phrases that people have, like life isn't fair, get over it, or life is fair, everyone gets screwed. And I think those are helpful, but only to a point, because what's more important, I think, is what you were alluding to in your opening statement, which is how do we move toward greater fairness? And if everything is stacked against that, it is hard, and it's going to be hard. It's going to require consistent effort, and in small ways, like when you're, for instance, in the workplace and you see people being treated differently, often women expressing that men are treated differently in the workplace, either by how much they're being paid, by responsibilities they're being given. I mean, some people say tall people are actually less discriminated against in the workplace than shorter people.
I heard some factoid about that once, that something like 75% or 80%, some huge number of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are men over 6 feet tall. Have you heard this before?
Yep.
Like height is really a thing.
Yep. I know. And as a vertically challenged person, I've just had to get louder and louder and bigger in my personality so that I take up more space in some other fashion because I'm challenged in the height department. But in general, I think the kind of advice that people who are really looking at this, for the workplace for just this moment, is to really see what your role in it is, right? If, that on some level, if something is unfair, do I have a role in that? And if so, can I change my behavior? Can I restore the balance? Can I, if I see inequality, even if it doesn't impact me, can I call it out? Can I be transparent? Can I cooperate so that, for instance, work is distributed more evenly? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really big question with, a lot of, I think that fairness and unfairness, and I know we're going to dive into, sort of origins of our concept that things should be fair. We're going to talk about where that comes from and the way that that's adapted over or changed over time. I think that for me, so much of it comes down to the question, fairness in general comes down to the question of equality versus equity. You know what I mean?
I do, but please explain.
Well, equity involves trying to understand individuals to figure out what to give them so they can enjoy full, healthy lives, whereas equality aims to ensure that everyone has the same thing. Now, for me, what it comes down to generally is access. So there's personal responsibility, and we all should respond to challenges and difficulty in, as well as we possibly can to try to overcome it. However, I'll take myself as example. My first example, I'm in a very different position than a lot of other people in terms of dealing with challenges in my life. I was raised by people with means. I'm Caucasian. I have a body that works the way that, standard norms expect a body to work. And so adversity for me is very different from somebody, there are a whole list of other things that are privileges that I have. And so adversity for me looks very different from somebody who was raised under different circumstances, has faced different challenges in their own lives, and is perhaps working from a place with less privilege. Now, there are also people with more privilege than I have, and then people with much less privilege than what I just said. And I think that when you think about equity versus equality, part of the question of overcoming bias, of creating a more fair and equal world is not just about giving everybody the same thing, but also lifting up those who need it, so that they are if someone is not at the same starting point as someone with more privilege, doing what we can to overcome that so that they can actually experience a deeper sense of equality. That's what equity is. And so
it's leveling the playing field.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind in conversations like this.
And it's hard to do that. I think it's important to state that there are going to, when you do that, like with affirmative action programs, things like that, there are always going to be instances and individuals who can claim that something wasn't fair to them personally. And that may be so, right? That just may be so. But in an attempt to right some serious systemic wrongs, systems that have been in place, I'm comfortable with the term white supremacy. We have lived and grown up and functioned in a culture of white supremacy, and there's a lot that we have to do to level the playing field at this point.
Well, it's tricky, I think, for a lot of people, because I think that there are so many people who get triggered by discussions of white supremacy because it makes them feel like they are, that they are being called bad. And we have to simultaneously hold that. Well, first of all, I think white people, all white people, have to acknowledge and accept and come to terms with the fact that we have all benefited from white supremacy. And I also think that it's so important it's totally fine to be able to hold the ways that you have perhaps suffered in a culture of white supremacy, or perhaps, as a woman living in the patriarchy. It's really okay, I think, to hold the ways that you have had challenges in the society that we live in, while at the same time owning and acknowledging the way one is privileged. And I think when people aren't able to hold, especially white people, aren't able to hold both, or where they're not able to hold the ways that white privilege has absolutely benefited them, that's where the conversation gets difficult, because people get too triggered to be able to stay in conversation.
So I have two things to say to that. One is, do not confuse the term white supremacist with the system of white supremacy.
Yes.
So a white supremacist, that's an extreme case, right? Those are the Klansmen and that extreme Jews will not replace us people, all of that. White supremacy is a system which, no matter what you do or don't do, it impacts you no matter what race or nationality or gender or sexuality or anything that you are getting messages reinforced constantly by that system. So not only is it that white people need to come to terms with the ways in which they've benefited from white privilege, but it also behooves us as white people to take a look at the ways that, even though we think of ourselves as open-minded and liberal, we have been victimized by that system of white supremacy to have certain kinds of reactions that perhaps we're not proud of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this notion of I'm colorblind is BS. Nobody is colorblind.
Also, being colorblind, not only is it BS, but we shouldn't be colorblind, because not seeing someone's race, origin, that's not seeing, first of all, like you said, it's BS. It's not actually possible because of the way our brains work. But also, I want to be seen for all the things that I am, and I want to see other people for all the things that they are, because I think that increases understanding. And especially getting back to the idea of equity, understanding what somebody might have experienced as a result of their, I'm using color as a loose term, is so important when you take into consideration what it looks like to create a world with more equity and more equality.
Amen. So let's look at animals for just a minute, because when we talk about what we can learn and where this all comes from, the animal kingdom, who's in all animals, their brains are very different than human brains. But there are things that we can learn. And so I bring you the vampire bat. Don't laugh. Mm-mm. So the vampire bats cooperate to avoid different situations, and they partner up. It's quite interesting. If a vampire bat is hungry and can't get himself or herself food, he or she asks for help. A fellow group member goes and gets food, comes back, regurgitates the blood for its pal, and then they remember. So that if that vampire bat who donated and went and did this good deed for the other vampire bat, if that donator is ever in need, the recipient reciprocates. So once one does a favor for the other, they hang on to that and return the favor. It's like they've got a lifetime guarantee that someone's has their back. There are animal rules for keeping score. So fairness is really, right? It's about keeping score. And in relationships, when we do this, it tends to not be a good thing. Mm-hmm. I did this. What did you do? We all do it. It's basic human nature. And certainly we do it as kids. So we will get to this section of today's episode where we talk about how to help your kids think in terms of fairness and respect the idea of fairness. But here are some animal rules for keeping score. Never be first to defect. Retaliate only after the partner defects. Retaliate once and then forgive and cooperate. And only use this strategy in a partnership. So I think there's a lot we can learn from animals. And I'm wondering if you think of, say, for instance, two kids, and maybe Sasha is too young for this, but I'm sure that you can imagine her a little older and Anna a little older and them fighting over a toy. Mm-hmm. And how you might be able to help them. We can't help ourselves. We treat people differently, right? This is where bias comes in again. We may treat them differently because one is older and we think the older one can handle more responsibility. Or we might treat them differently because we think the older one has challenges that the younger one doesn't have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Figuring out fair solutions for common conflicts is very tricky.
Well, I have kind of a different perspective on specifically on the fairness of sharing than certainly like what I was raised with, what the standard seems to be. I'm in a totally new situation when it comes to sharing and fairness. My brother and I, who got to sit in the front seat when we were older, we battled over that. But in terms of stuff, which is the first thing that came to mind, Sasha is only 14 months, almost 15 months. So the things she's interested in, the things that Anna is interested in are a little different. However, my brother and I never wanted the same. We never really needed to share because I didn't want any of his toys. He didn't want any of mine. But with Anna and Sasha, there are definitely times when one of them is playing with something, the other one wants it. And I am of the opinion that sharing is not it's not so obvious as, give that to your sister or, I'm into the idea of taking turns, but I also think it's okay for them to have things that they don't share. And so far, Anna is the only one who has really strong feelings about some belongings being just hers and not for sharing. But if you were, the example I always hear, if you were reading a book, I wouldn't go up to you and say, I want to read that book, give it to me, and expect you to give me the book, right? I might say to you, hey, I'd love to read that book. Do you think that maybe when you're done with it, I could borrow it? And now, of course, we are adults, and so you have the right to say, I'd really rather not share this book. It's special. But I also think it's okay for kids to, I'm in the same way on playgrounds. I always feel uncomfortable when one of my kids wants something that another kid has and the parent makes them give it to my kid, because I don't think that that's how ownership and stuff works. But that said, the way we run a household is taking turns generally with belongings is something that's necessary. We haven't really encountered, she got this many crackers or this many chips or this many scoops of ice cream, therefore I deserve the same thing. That hasn't happened yet. And I'm not sure where I stand on that in the equity versus equality way of doing things. But,
So this is interesting. I did a little research on this, and there are some tips for helping children figure out when an option is fair. And then this is probably when kids are a little older and they're trying to work out their own stuff. Mm-hmm. So the ownership question is interesting. Who has a right to it? Is the ball the school's ball, for instance, and everyone has an equal right to it? Or did one child bring that ball and therefore it's their ball and they have a greater say in who is holding the ball at any given time? If everyone has a right to it, does everybody have an equal opportunity? Like, what if there's not enough to go around?
It's a tricky one.
That sort of thing. Has the group agreed on what to do? In general, the experts say really reviewing the rules of the game in advance is a good idea. And that's true for whatever the play is. It could mean even telling your children, right now, Anna is playing with this toy, and when she's done with it, you can ask her if you can play with it. Mm-hmm. So that's like reviewing the rules. What's another one? Oh, asking for a do-over because you lost. Generally speaking, you can either agree in advance that that's fair or not fair.
Right. I think so much of that, one thing that I think just in terms of kids and fairness, one thing I think about a lot is what are the benchmarks of, what are the expectations of a kid based on their age and ability, And so like at Anna's age, I think that being she's a super emotionally intense 4-year-old, newly 4. And I think that it is my opinion that being, pardon my phrasing, but like a real hard ass about winning and losing isn't exactly necessarily the most helpful thing to her. And so we're sort of trying to ease in this idea of, if you lose a game, that's okay. We'll do another one. But it's a really tricky one because you want to expose kids to the way that the world works, but you also want to protect them from, how that can be for them. I don't know. Like managing.
It depends. If they lose all the time, then that's an issue.
Right.
But good sportsmanship is something to teach. It counts, right? It matters. What does that mean? I think that's why play among peers when children are growing up at every age is important. It's important to learn that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. It's important to learn that nobody likes whining.
Yeah.
It's important to learn that mistakes happen often, honest mistakes. Another thing that I learned about fairness that I think is really interesting is fairness implies that if an outcome were reversed, it would be just as fair. In other words, what I'm suggesting right now, does that work if the shoe were on the other foot, right? If I were the recipient of the shorter end of the stick, would I think that's just as fair as if I were the recipient of the longer end? So these are all really difficult. Another thing is things can be not nice and still be fair. You don't have to be happy with every solution, and you're not going to be happy with every solution. Kids always say that's not fair. I mean, this is a phrase that parents, hear probably multiple times per day. But what fairness means is that everybody in the group has an equal opportunity to benefit. That's equity, right?
Right.
Everybody has a chance. So, for instance, in a classroom, if a teacher says, if you finish your work, you can go play on the computer. Everybody has the opportunity to finish their work. If she said instead, every right-handed person gets computer time in 15 minutes, that's not fair because that's not in anybody's control. Now, of course, you can say, but some people finish their work faster. And that's not fair. So maybe accommodations need to be made and more time needs to be given to the kid who works more slowly. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to get into that level of nuance, but I think overall the goal is to create an even playing field where everybody has an equal opportunity or somewhere near an equal opportunity, or at least an opportunity, if not equal, to benefit.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I mean, it's interesting. The first thing I thought of when you said, if you finish your work early, you can go play on the computer. I immediately thought of, well, like, what's that like for the dyslexic kid who, maybe has accommodations, but takes a long time. And, I guess it's like on one hand, being protected, on one hand, being protected from every bad feeling in life isn't necessarily good for kids. On the other hand, I wonder if that teacher might vary, this hypothetical teacher that we're talking about might vary what rewards look like. Maybe sometimes it's time-based, maybe sometimes sometimes there's a way to specifically address what it might feel like for that kid, to maybe coming up sometimes with a reward that isn't necessarily tied to time. I'm not sure.
That's why all this is so difficult. Mm-hmm. It's difficult as parents. It's difficult certainly for teachers. It's difficult for coaches. It's difficult for bosses, managers. But it is incumbent upon all of us who make the rules in whatever situation to pay attention to this and to try to create a more equitable playing field. I have two more little animal things to share because I love animals so much. So it is not always fair in the animal kingdom. Albatross chicks, for instance, like there's serious sexism. The males are fed and they survive better. They're fed more. And the females are fed less and have a much lower survival rate. And then the other one is the capuchin monkeys. They refuse to work if they don't get equal reward. So
they're
literally,
a union.
like if
little monkey union.
They pretty much are. If someone was unfair to them and didn't give them as much food, they will literally refuse to work.
What does working look like for these monkeys?
I don't know. It's a very good question.
Are they have typewriters? Are they writing
I didn't dig that
Shakespeare?
deep. I'm not sure what they do, but I have respect for them. I'll tell you that. Yeah. Okay, now we have to shift gears completely because there's a whole area of fairness that I am really, really fascinated in and happen to have a lot of personal experience in that I want to share. And that is something called the Fairness Doctrine. Have you ever heard of this?
I can't say I have.
It was a policy of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that was implemented in 1949 and was in effect from 1949 to 1987. And I was in broadcasting from 75 to 87. And part of my job every one of those years was to make sure that the radio station for which I was working was in compliance with the Fairness Doctrine. Fairness Doctrine sounds very kind of like policy wonky. Here's what it was. It required any broadcast licensee, so anybody who held a broadcast license, to address controversial issues of public importance by fairly reflecting differing opinions. So radio and television stations, it was incumbent upon them to air different sides of an issue if it was an issue of public importance. Now think about that. The government did not tell radio stations and television stations how to do that. They said you have to do it. The radio and television stations had to say how they were going to do it. And this was how they got awarded their license and got their license renewed. So this was abolished in 1987 when broadcasting, along with many other industries, was deregulated. You remember this was during, the Reagan administration, and everything was being deregulated, the thought being free markets can regulate themselves. But here's what happened. Once the Fairness Doctrine was removed, you ended up with, for instance, Rush Limbaugh on stations all over the place. Literally 1 year after the Fairness Doctrine was lifted, Rush Limbaugh was signed to a nationwide syndication. He'd been working at a little small Sacramento station. Stations all across the country got the show for free if they let Ed McLaughlin, who was the guy who signed Rush, to sell 4 minutes of advertising per hour, and they could sell the rest. They got all the programming for free. So from day one, Limbaugh was vicious on the air, talking about conspiracy theories as if they were the truth, calling women feminazis, all this stuff that would have had him yanked off the air when the Fairness Doctrine was in effect. I contend that if the Fairness Doctrine were still in effect, our country would not be so polarized as it is today. You would not have people who are only hearing Sean Hannity and his ilk and nothing else, because stations, in order to actually make the money, which is what they're all in the business to do, had to prove that they were operating in the public interest. And to give one side of the issue, and MSNBC does this too, so it's not just the right wing, to give one side of an issue. And this isn't about equal time. Equal time, the equal time law, I believe, is still in effect, and that refers to candidates. So that's different. This is making some effort to represent opposing viewpoints.
Yeah.
So I feel really strongly that if you let people do exactly what they want to do, what will happen is greed will take over.
Oh, well,
And
yes. Yes.
right?
I mean,
We will not necessarily all give to charity if if we don't have to. If we don't have to give, right?
Because keeping some people, oppressed and suppressed is good for capitalism. I mean, they want us to keep, big companies want us to keep on mindlessly consuming. And that is, I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Sensationalism sells.
Yeah.
So if you put people on the air saying outrageous things, doesn't matter if it's true or not, right? They can be feeding the public with all sorts of falsehoods, but it sells because it's compelling. You want to go, oh my God, what's the next most outrageous thing he's going to say?
I mean, the way that, and I'm sure that this is in conjunction with the Fairness Act, but the way that the internet and the ads model and clickbait has impacted the information that we have and how we understand the what's going on in the world is cannot be overstated. And of course, once you bring Facebook, I'm getting so upset. I'm hitting my mic. Once you get once you bring social media and the greed of big tech companies.
Well, and the algorithms that just send us certain kinds of information.
Because it feels good to be in. It feels good to be in a bubble, to hear information that feels like my own thoughts, but echoed more intensely, and that's what brings people.
But
to
living in echo
thoughts.
chambers is not good for society.
No,
it's
it's
not
good.
No. It's not good. We need to be able to have civil discourse, and we can't have civil discourse if we don't get to hear opposing opinions. And so I'm not getting into a fight to bring back the Fairness Doctrine. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think it's important for people to know historically that there were people in this country who fought for that, who understood that having access to the airwaves was a privilege and not a right, that it wasn't just about how much money you have. You also were limited as to how many stations you could own. That all went out the window too. So now we have fewer and fewer and fewer corporate entities owning more and more and more of our broadcast outlets and trying to have, consistent programming across the country. This is the same way we have chain restaurants everywhere and stores that are eliminating mom and pop operations. Mom and pop radio stations and television stations are a thing of the past. But also what you lose is regionalism. You lose local flavor. You lose the discussion of local issues, which was always something you could count on for radio stations. It was my job for many years to go out and interview community leaders of all sorts in the public sector and the private sector, all of the above, and ask them what the issues were that they were working on. And then I had to write up reports and show these are the top issues. And here's what I'm going to do as a programmer to address those issues. If, for instance, one year teen pregnancy came up as a very big issue in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was incumbent upon me then to make sure that I produced some programs where we could understand what are some of the solutions that people are working on to address this issue so that you could get involved.
Your opinion about these issues is not a part of, and you becoming a talking head about these issues, someone who that's not a part of what you're talking about. What you're saying is your job was to present the information, bring on, various kinds of experts maybe, and talk about the multiple sides of this issue. But that just sounds light years away from what a piece about something like that would be today on the left or the right, like left skewing or right skewing.
So two things. And this comes back to the very first point you made, which is that bias is inevitable. As a journalist, I was always trying to be impartial and be fair, but I had to acknowledge that I had distinct biases. And the radio stations for which I worked tended to be liberal, progressive. And so I didn't need to hide my perspective. I just needed to give the opportunity for other perspectives respectfully.
Yeah.
So that is a little different. We're in a very different world now. And as a result, I think if fairness isn't mandated anymore, and in a lot of the world it is, and in a lot of the world it isn't, then, and I think this is our final point today, it has come back in terms of talking about the workplace, in terms of the schoolyard, in terms of everything, how we get our information. It's incumbent upon us as individuals to do what we can to increase fairness and equity.
And that means looking beyond our own immediate perspective and our own immediate experience.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening to All the F Words. We want to let you know that we are having a live Zoom event. Is that an oxymoron? If it's Zoom, does that mean it's not live? I don't know. But this is going to be on Zoom, available for anyone who registers on Tuesday, May 10th, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. We are doing All the F Words Jewish edition. So follow us on social media in order to find out more.
We'll have more information on our social media channels, which are Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at allthefwordspod.
Bye-bye.
Bye.